With data validation and data annotations, all of the information is contained within the model and the views and the controllers that's needed to do the validation. The view handles the user interface, but nothing more. The model is just concerned with the data and the business rules. But everything is not always black and white here. So where does the data validation fit? Well, the data store has the data requirements, and they seem to be in the domain of the model. But the user interface has a role in enforcing the rules. So the clear answer is the model. Validation attributes implement the validation with the attributes of the system.componentModel.DataAnnotations namespace. The handle is most common of the validation tasks. Here you can create your own custom validation attributes that also inherit from the valid attribute class. Here's a list of some validation attributes. The ones noted in bold are new to MVC4, such as credit card, email address, file extension, phone, and URL. Some of the more common ones in this list are allow HTML, compare, data type, range, regular expression. The first attribute that we'll look at is the compare attribute. This lets you compare two different properties for equality. It is bit limited, and the account controller makes good use of it for passwords. The next attribute that we're going to look at is the allow HTML attribute. There's really nasty stuff out there called cross-site scripting that are attacks on the web, and these usually are by injecting scripting into data used by any web page. ASP.NET protects this through request validation by automatically raising exceptions for dangerous data coming across. This is turned on by default, although you can turn it off with the page's validate request attribute. MVC has long had the validate input attribute, but this is way too blunt of a tool to use. MVC4 also includes the allow HTML attribute, and this is to apply the individual properties of a model. So this will help protect your page from injection attacks via cross-site scripting. The next attribute that we're going to talk about is the remote attribute. In old versions of MVC, this was hard to use server-side code that was just needed for client-side validation. The remote attribute makes it simple. This uses jQuery validation's plugins for the remote validator. This makes the validation code highly responsive to user input issues. In this demo, we're going to take a look at the remote attribute, which is a very powerful data annotation that can be used whether you're doing an Ajax call or a normal server-side post within your form. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at our project, and we'll go ahead and run it to see what it's actually doing and to see what to expect the normal way, and then we'll replace it, the data annotation, with our own for the remote attribute. So let's go ahead and go into our dog list, create new, give it a test, and we'll give it an age that we know is really up there. And because we're using unobtrusive Ajax and we have the client-side validation enabled, it automatically fired the error must be between 0 and 20 because we put in a high enough age. So that's our expected result. Let's go ahead and close this down. We'll stop debugging. And the first thing we're going to do is open up our model, our dog model. And what threw the error was right here, which is just a simple range, which is built into MVC. And what we want to do now is use the remote attribute right beneath it. And what's really great about this is that remote attribute, which is parts built into MVC, we can say, hey, I want you to call this method within this controller, and if it's false, if it comes back false, then display this error message here. So regardless if you're making a call that involves this property here of age in particular, regardless if you're doing it via Ajax or via server-side, this remote allows the error to be passed and you execute a server-side method to return a true or false. So it doesn't matter how it's getting called, it's agnostic in that term because it doesn't care. It says, hey, I'm being executed by the server, so I'm just going to give you a true false back. So let's take a look at the method that is being called here by the remote attribute. So we're going to go into our dog controller and go ahead and scroll down and find our valid age. And here we have action result of valid age that's expecting an integer of age, and it's just doing a comparison. It's returning JSON and it's doing a comparison if the age is greater than or equal to 0 or if it's less than or equal to 20. If those two conditions are met, it'll return true. And again, if you have hopped over to the Ajax chapter, you will know about the JSON request allow get, because a JSON being returned is in plain text. So, and to have further security, we need to say that this is allowed to leave the server, if you will. We are allowing this data to pass, because if you don't do this, then it'll actually throw an error, and you can only see that error if it's an Ajax request if you use Fiddler or Firebug. And also, as you can see here, commented out, the wrong way of doing this is actually trying to return a Boolean with the same type of properties. MVC does not work that way. It has to be action result returning a JSON formatted string as if you called this directly from Ajax. Okay, so here this is the method we're calling. It's returning a Boolean based on this condition. Remote attribute is what's calling it, and it knows the controller, and if it's false, it'll pass this message across. We don't have to change anything else, so let's go ahead and save, and we'll go ahead and you know what, I already put a breakpoint there so we can see that in action. So let's go ahead and run this guy. So what's going to happen is when we get into the create controller and we put in bad data within this age group here, actually put in a number, so 123. As soon as the focus leaves this into another field, it's going to try to fire that remote attribute and run that server-side method to do a check to see if this is a valid age or not. So there's a slight delay. So what it did is it first hopped to our model and said, are there any data annotations I need to pay attention to? Required, well, that was met because I put a value in. And then hit here, it said, oh, remote. So, okay, so for remote, I need to run this method here of valid age within this dog controller. And if it's false, I need to return this message. So here we go. So here's the action result it's trying to run. Our age coming in is 123. So stepping into it, our age is obviously greater than 0, but this is not true where our age is less than or equal to 20. So this should return false back to the attribute, thus throwing the warning, which is right here, from our remote attribute. So this is something that's been challenging in previous versions of MVC, where you really had to do a nice song and dance to get this to work right, and they've done a good job in making this really simplistic so that you can have these remote attributes as annotations in your model to run server-side code that can be complex if you really need to do a check on whether or not something is valid or not. Another example besides the age example that we have here that would be a very common use, like if you had a registration form and somebody typed in their email address or a username, and as soon as the focus left that particular text box, you did a lookup against your database looking to see if that was valid or not, or in use, or both for that matter, and then you could return the true or false and throw an error to the screen. That's a very common way to use the remote attribute.